righty. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. It's a nice semi-full auditorium, which is always nice to see. So before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. So we're really delighted to have our guest speaker today, but I'm actually going to ask our Vice Dean Research for the faculty, Dr. Nish Panu, to introduce our speaker.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you to Dr. Kassam for that kind introduction. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Dr. Brenda Hemmelgarn, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. Today's special medical grand rounds is focused on research, its place in the health system, and the importance of medical journals in disseminating that research out to the world. Thank you to all of you who are attending in person and those of you who are watching virtually. As many of you already know, this morning's talk is one of 3 presentations being given to our faculty today by our guest expert, Dr. Kirsten Patrick. Research is obviously a core mission of the University of Alberta and a key component of the faculty's strategic plan. Today, we're here to focus on the last mile of research, so how discoveries made through all of our efforts find their way from our labs and research groups to the communities that we serve. Dr. Patrick is currently the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Medical Association Journal, Canada's leading peer-reviewed medical journal. She completed her medical education in South Africa and the UK. While living and working in the UK, she did a fellowship with the British Medical Journal, and which quickly became her full-time job. In 2013, she accepted a role with the Canadian Medical Association Journal and moved to Canada and has been here ever since. She has 17 years experience as an editor, initially at the BMJ and then at CMAJ. Dr. Patrick brings an in-depth understanding of how medical journals can help us share our work with the world. She also holds a master's degree in global health policy. Today, Dr. Patrick is here to share an insider's view and about the role of medical journals in the health system, what works, what could be improved, and how researchers can leverage these tools to get our work out there into the community. I thank you all for being here to learn. And I thank Dr. Patrick for joining us for this early morning discussion, as well as other presentations that she's sharing with us throughout the day. Now, please join me in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Patrick.
I don't have a very loud voice. And all of you online, thank you for logging in to listen to me today. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for arranging this, and Dr. Panu for your invitation and your introduction. So it's quite rare for a medical editor to be invited to speak to eminent groups like this, poke our head above the parapet of our computer screen. And I guess that my job today is to convince you that you should care about medical journals and specifically about your National Medical Journal, CMAJ. So I'm posing a question here. Are they an important part of our health system or increasingly irrelevant? And I guess it's a kind of a spoiler alert, because my viewpoint is that they are not irrelevant and they should continue to be relevant and supported. Just in terms of competing interests, I don't really have any other than, I'm the editor of a medical journal, and I'm kind of hoping you'll submit your great stuff to us. And also for the talk to researchers later, I was part of the working group that developed the record reporting guideline. And I do talk about reporting guidelines in that talk. So figuring out how to move slides. There we go. So I'm a big fan of Hannah Gadsby. And I don't know if you've seen this stand-up comedy special on Netflix, but in the beginning, she starts off by saying, I'm going to tell you what your expectations should be, and then you won't be surprised. So I'm going to do that. That the objectives here, from my perspective, are that you understand the role that medical journals do play now and historically have played in health systems, wider health systems, not just the information ecosystem. And then consider how well journals are doing their jobs, historically and now. And consider how they can evolve and are evolving in a rapidly changing health information ecosystem. And I hope that will be useful to you. I always ask, who did I follow? Who was last week's speaker? Because when I spoke at Sunnybrook, I was the week after the rock star Peter Uni, and I was kind of intimidated by that. But I think it's an interesting thing to get a perspective of how a medical journal operates. It's a bit of a black box. So this is my helpful slide to understand medical journals and my role in health systems, because if you're a doctor that trained and practiced and now doesn't practice, sometimes you feel like maybe you compromised yourself. But I like to look at my role as a journal as contributing to the health system at large still. This is the WHO System Framework Schema from 2007, from their Framework for Action on Strengthening Health Systems. Now, many of you might know that this model has since been updated in various iterations. It's now more of a circular thing that centers people. But I like this one because I can really, really clearly see where the medical information ecosystem fits in this infrastructure. And the place is in information. So these are the system building blocks on the left-hand side, and information contributes to service delivery, it contributes to financing, and it contributes to leadership and governance. But the most important thing is that that information needs to be real and true. You know, in terms of research, data are generated, and then researchers and knowledge translation experts create meaningful info from those data. But the key thing is that they need to be accurate. Otherwise, we're not going to be delivering a working healthcare system. And there are increasingly lots of sources of medical misinformation. And medical information, they aren't all equal. So a key thing that journals do is to contribute to the validation and filtration of information through their editorial and peer review processes. So hold that thought about one of the roles of a journal, and I'll come back to it. I'm going to give you a history lesson about journals, which can help you to understand their function. This is a slide that just indicates a few journals that are well known to most people. Up here in the right-hand corner represents the first scientific journal, which was called Philosophical Transactions, and that was started about 355 years ago in 1665 by the then Secretary of the Royal Society. And it was to promote the enterprise of early modern science. So journals were essentially developed to solve two problems: dissemination and registration. Prior to 1665, scientists and learned gentlemen with an interest or an expertise communicated largely by passing letters between each other. And then by 1665, there were too many actors in this soup for this to be workable. So the solution was to ask all these scientists and learned people to mail their letters to a single person, such as, in this case, Henry Oldenburg, who was the Philosophical Transactions editor. And he would then typeset, print, and bind the letters into a new thing called a journal, and mail out copies to all the other subscribing scientists at once. So dissemination is solved. And then the product got scaled, right? Lots of other journals. And also registration. This is my work. I have my name on it, right? A record is kept. So although not a medical journal, Philosophical Transactions is really key to the beginning, and it did have some role in, you know, the medical information infrastructure, because it work in that journal managed to convince vaccine hesitant doctors and the general public in the early 18th century of England of the effectiveness of the smallpox vaccine. But talking about philosophical transactions helps me to pivot to historically an important feature of journals, and that is that they are society owned. So societies thought that it would be great if they could have these journals that would make them look good, and all their eminent members could publish in them, and it's a place for, as Hannah Gadsby would say, men to name all of the things. So the forerunner to the eminent NEJM was founded by these two Boston physicians and first published in 1812. And then it was bought by the Massachusetts Medical Association 99 years later in 1921. So it actually became the NEJM after CMAJ began. And then JAMA, on the other hand, was actually started by the American Medical Association in 1883, and it developed out of a newsletter to society about proceedings, and then it became a journal. The BMJ also started life as a society journal in 1840 as the Journal of the Provincial Medical and Surgical Association, which later became the British Medical Association. And societies liked to have these journals because it was a way for them to make money. So journals don't make money much anymore, except in some cases. And Canadian physicians naturally also wanted a place to showcase their contributions to medical science and share their knowledge with their 70,000 odd colleagues across the country. So the Canadian Medical Association launched its journal in 1911, and the CMAJ has published continuously since then. So I guess it's about 13 years old. And I left the Lancet till last because that's a bit of an outlier, even though it's one of the oldest. The Lancet was launched in 1823 by a very young 28-year-old GP called Thomas Wakely, who wanted to kind of democratize this information from this stuffy, eminent, we are the owners of this information. He wanted to kind of democratize it and inform and reform. And he wanted the Lancet to be for the profession at large, rather than an eminent few. For doctors outside of big cities. And he published reports on lectures given by prominent doctors in London, for which he got into a bit of trouble. And he also published interesting case reports, news reports, and articles that would entertain doctors as well as lay people. So kind of forward thinking, because that's what we're all trying to do now in general medical journals, be a smorgasbord, quasi-activists. That's the approach we're all taking today, to try to stay relevant, to try to appeal to younger audience, and to democratize information. So just to talk about what CMAJ is, because I think sometimes you think it's not like a specialist society journal, which will usually have one editor-in-chief who volunteers their time and maybe a couple of associate editors who also volunteer their time, and then it will be published by an outside publisher. At CMAJ, this general medical journal, wholly owned by the CMA, contains editorial and publishing divisions, and we do all our copy editing in-house. It's an international journal, and we do get reads and uptake and contributions internationally, but our primary audiences are practicing clinicians in Canada, especially generalists, general internists, and also Canadian policy leaders and managers. So we do a bunch of articles that speak to Canadian policy and try to inform the way that health systems in this country are structured. We have about 6 staff editors, including myself. We have a pool of freelance editors, maybe 17 to 20, who work on the various sections of the journal. 3 freelance statisticians, a number of processing and copy editing staff, a social media person, and a communications person, so who does author and institution outreach and liaises with media. On the publishing side, we have web and print production people. We still produce between 10 and 12 print magazines a year. And the online digital issue that comes out every week is the issue of record. Not everything makes it into a print copy. And we have still sales staff, designers. And then we have a freelance production person and 2 freelance podcast hosts for our podcast, which is growing in popularity. Now, now we know about the history of medical journals and why they exist and why they got set up. I want to consider their purpose. So I created this figure out of a talk that was given by Dr. Richard Smith, who was a previous editor of the BMJ before Fiona Godley. And he delivered this lecture in 2016, and he was a very cynical guy. So remember that I kind of argued earlier that journals contribute to the need for health system decisions and therefore need to be full of true and good information. But Smith looked at these other purposes, and he would say that most people think that the key purpose of a journal is to publish science, like medical research, right? There are now about 30,000 medical journals that do this, and more every day. And this is what most of them do. But and some journals only do that, but general medical journals on the whole do other things as well. And Smith argued that journals actually do a really poor job of publishing science. And quite a poor job of swiftly getting new medical information out there. So other journals may also try to meet their readers' continuing education needs, by summarizing new information. They also can provide a forum for discussion. So for example, if there's some disagreement with something that we published, there may be a what we call it post-publication peer review, an exchange of letters, some of which are published. Could just be for the purposes of informing about new trends. Smith argued that journals should be leading and agenda setting, and I think that a lot of medical journals do try to do that. Think about the Lancet's Global Health Commissions, for example. That's kind of agenda setting. Research policy agendas. He argued that they play a role in picking up research fraud, which happens, unfortunately. Thinking about Thomas Wakely and the Lancet, definitely there's a role for journals, entertaining people. And then he was cynically saying that what they do best is to enhance careers, so you get published, you get noticed, and you advance in your career. They promote drugs, and they make money, not so much anymore. Some journals do. Journals that publish drug trials do make a lot of money because the drug companies order reprints of those trials. Okay. So somebody else looked at the purposes of scholarly publishing, and this I'm stealing from a 2010 Scholarly Kitchen blog by Michael Clark, which he entitled, "Why Hasn't Scientific Publishing Been Disrupted Yet?" And he meant by the internet. So why do we still have journals, right? You could just do research and post it online and everybody could see it. And he said that scientific journals had developed to fulfill several core functions: registration and distribution of research I talked about earlier when I was talking about the history. And there's validation and filtration. So that's basically the editorial and peer review process that vets articles and ensures their scientific robustness. Not a perfect system, but it's the one we have. And finally, designation, by which he meant ranking academics, but another way that you can think about designation is like funneling research towards specialists or towards generalists or towards policymakers, by making journals focus on a particular area. So the internet has managed to disrupt registration and distribution somewhat. You can definitely get your research out there. It's easy to find research findings on repositories. Sometimes this is mandated, preprint servers, blogs, anyone can self-publish. But the validation and filtration designation functions of journals are not that easily disrupted. And even in the 2020s, they still require a human decision. And there are people who say that AI will disrupt it even further. But at this point, we're not seeing AI that's good enough to separate out the wheat from the chaff in terms of accuracy of research findings. AI tends to come to its limitations of its training and then make things up, and that's a problem. So for now, journals are still existing and relatively resistant to disruption. But that doesn't mean that they're perfect and should stay as they are. So what do we have here? Aside from the cardinal sin of a table without a title. This is kind of to illustrate how journals play a role and are still relevant. This is the end of 2020. It's the top 15 research articles that we published in CMAJ with the sections that they came from and the views that they had. And you'll see that most of them that I've done a little COVID icon next to were COVID-19 research. So we published really quickly and tried to do the best job and the fastest job with peer review that we could during the pandemic to get information out there really quickly. And it was difficult, you know, because there's this feeling of being rushed. Historically, we take our time just to make sure that the science is really accurate. And things did happen in 2020. There were lots of retractions of COVID research when we realized, well, not us, but other journals realized that we had published things that were inaccurate. And so there's this role that post-publication peer review plays of saying, hey, that doesn't really scan, or new information has come to light. But we did the best job that we could and published a lot of research on COVID-19 that has actually contributed to CMAJ's impact factor more than doubling in the last couple of years because it was so well used, so well read, and so well cited. Just for comparison, this is 2023, the top 10. No COVID-19 articles there, I think. So you can kind of get an idea of what is most popular when we're not in the middle of a pandemic crisis. So supporting validation and filtration better and ensuring this better, robust sound information. We can't just go, well, it's peer review and we're done, you know, because everybody knows that peer review is really, really flawed. Studies have been done to show that if you send the same paper to peer review to 10 people, there's not much agreement between them about how the paper should go forward. So it's a thing that editors take into account, but we also have our statistical consultants so that we can check the robustness of the statistical analysis, for example, take in different pieces to decide on the relevance and accuracy of research. And I'm going to go back into that in some more detail in my next talk. But things have developed in the last, I would say, 3, possibly 4 decades to support journals to do their job better. So we're not just publishing, you know, bad trials or the research of our friends. We're having good, transparent processes. One of these was the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors was formed, which was a group of high impact journals that is probably over-representative of North America and Europe, that put together standards for medical publishing and continue to revise those. Things like standards for authorship, to which we refer and CMAJ follows a lot of their policies. The Committee on Publication Ethics has done a great deal of work on what journals can do and institutions can do to deal with research fraud, because people do make up research, and they really want their findings to be something, so they, tweak things a bit. How do we show that? How do we deal with it? How do we make it right? When it became apparent that too much new research or too many trials were being published in disparate journals for folks to be able to keep up with them, the Cochrane group was formed to create systematic reviews on key topics. So they would scan all the work in a particular, all the trials in a particular area, and do systematic reviews and meta-analysis to come up with a kind of an overall answer. And the Cochrane group continues to evolve and has offices in various countries, including Canada. All trials. So it became apparent that lots of trials were funded and conducted, but lots of results weren't published, and that's a loss for the health system. And often it was because they weren't positive. So journals were biasing towards publishing trials with positive results, and those where the finding was, equivocal or negative, often didn't get published. So work has been done to make sure that trials get published, even if they don't get published in journals, so in repositories. Other things that journals have done is to, for example, CMAJ ensures that the ethics of trials by refusing to publish any trial that was not registered prior to enrollment of the first patient or participant, because otherwise you could kind of recruit a few patients and then change your approach based on your initial findings, and that biases the research outcome. So that's a policy of the ICMJE that we've adopted. Still problems with the publishing trials, and especially in a timely fashion. And then the middle icon, this one, those of you who are online, is the open access symbol. So that's another thing that journals used to be largely behind a paywall. Research used to be largely behind a paywall, and that made it accessible only to a few who would pay, and meant that not all research could be useful to policymakers and clinicians. So the open access movement was formed to ensure that research was published in a way that was open access to everybody. That often has resulted in authors having to pay a research publishing fee. But some journals like the CMAJ publish all their content open access. There is a research publication fee that reflects the greater work that goes into research articles, but everything else is also not behind the paywall. And then the last thing, which I will also mention in my next talk, is the Equator Network, which is a repository for reporting guidelines, which is a body of work that's vastly improved the reporting of research and therefore its usefulness to the health system. Okay, so this is, I'm coming back to COVID-19 research. Some very high profile journals did retract stuff that they were, rushing to be the first to publish on COVID-19 or in a particular area, and then new evidence came to light, or evidence of research fraud came to light afterwards, and they had to retract papers. Okay, so I put this slide in there here. What do you think this is? Yeah, it's good. I mean, it's just a picture that I took off the internet, but it kind of, we have this saying, it was something that we used to say at the BMJ, where, you know, historically, guidelines and journals and everything were run by gobsats, which is good old boys sat around a table. And we're trying, and we have slowly recognized that that's not okay, you know, that we need to have more diversity at the table. But the reason that I put this here is just to kind of address one of the elephants in the publishing room, is that journals hold a lot of power, really a lot of power. But they are steeped in a history that, like the health system, came out of oppression and the benefit of a few, and not very, you know, privilege and all of those things, and racism and colonialism. So this is something that journals are needing to address as well. It's something that's come kind of a bit more recently into awareness. So all those things that I mentioned in the previous slide about, you know, mechanisms and processes and best practices to improve the reporting of science didn't address the problem of inherent bias and systemic discrimination within journal systems, which are reflective of academic systems. So coming back here to this schema, I want to talk a little bit about agenda setting and leadership. And, you know, Smith, when he gave this lecture, he scored journals on how they did on each of these things. And he wasn't very particularly generous. He gave a 2 out of 10 score for publishing and organizing science, for example, and 4 out of 10 for education. He is actually quite famously pessimistic about the future role of medical journals in publishing research. And he wrote on the announcement of the retirement of Jeff Drazen, who was a previous editor of the NEJM, that the main job of journals will not be to disseminate science, but to speak truth to power, encourage debate, campaign, investigate, and agenda set. The same job as the mass media. And he said, the NEJM needs to strengthen that side of the journal. So for this, he was roundly criticized, with many US physicians telling him to mind his own business. Thanks very much. They like their medical science politics free and stay in his own lane and all of that. But I think he has a bit of a point. And I think journals are taking on that role. And I think that the new editor of the NEJM has done pretty well in addressing these topics that were not addressed before, and trying to lead and set an agenda, particularly in this area of anti-racism, AEDI, reckoning with the history of our systems. So CMAJ is also in a process of reckoning with its systemic issues. Prompted a little bit by criticism of the journal by various groups, I would say. I don't think anybody sits in their ivory tower system and thinks, let me disrupt it today, without a little bit of outside prodding. So we've all had that. In response to one particular issue, we undertook an AEDI audit, which started at the end of 2022 and was reported the very end of 2023, and we will soon be publishing that on our website, along with a list of, along with a plan for how we plan to implement the recommendations. So many things were suggested in that audit, in that report, and one of them was for the journal to accurately and clearly acknowledge that the past harms that the journal has engaged in, and entrenched biases and discrimination. So, you know, we've been publishing inside this kind of small closed system of a privileged few, rather than being representative of the entire medical community and the entire population. One thing that the journal is doing, which is part of a project spearheaded by the CMA, which I'm not not sure how much of this is in the public domain. I think the CMA has made an announcement that they plan to make an apology to Indigenous peoples in Canada on behalf of the profession, to acknowledge past harms from the CMA to Indigenous people in Canada. And they came to CMAJ and said, can you do your piece? They were going to search their archive of meeting proceedings and minutes and policies, and they wanted us to do a review of the journal and find places where the journal had been harmful towards Indigenous people. We said, fine, but there's a standard for doing this kind of work in the scientific realm, and we have to do a proper scientific review, a systematic review, protocol-led, according to proper methodology. That I heard a lovely thing yesterday when I was at dinner with you folks, that doesn't sprinkle a little bit of indigeneity on it at the end. You know, like we have to partner with an Indigenous organization right in the beginning to develop the protocol, then do the systematic review, report it properly. It needs to set a bar for how other journals would do it. So we're undertaking that at the moment. The other recommendation was to address lack of diversity, both in submissions to the journal, in our peer reviewer pool, and within our own workforce, because our own workforce is not representative of definitely the medical profession in Canada. So as we're hiring new people and recruiting new associate editors, we're addressing this issue of diversity. That takes a little bit of capacity building. So we have to kind of engage a little bit more upstream with med students and new researchers to kind of work with folks and teach them the way that journals operate and also take feedback. So the other recommendation is partnerships. You know, we have this very tight hold on how we want everything in the journal to be very accurate and unbiased. And so we apply this process, and the feedback that we get is that this is only one way of operating, and that you can have excellence through that is measured through other lenses. So to be able to partner with folks and get feedback on how our processes go, and also feedback on what we should be covering in the journal that we haven't covered before. And then engage in training. So training of peer reviewers to be able to peer review in an unbiased way. For example, training of editors in unconscious bias, and we're undertaking those. Okay. I thought I would leave it there and see if you have any questions. It's a lot to cover.
Given the multiple media by which information can be disseminated and the changing manner in which physicians and learners seek information and learn, how do you see the traditional journal changing to meet the obvious challenges these changes bring?
That's a really, really good question. I mean, if I speak to a kind of a younger audience than I see here, and I say, do you read the journal? They read it, they engage with it via social media, they engage with it via the podcast, they engage with it if we have video on Instagram, but it's quite difficult to get people to read a journal from a kind of a younger demographic. It's a tricky one. I mean, I think the traditional journal format still works, but people are more selective. So you don't get your paper journal and read it cover to cover necessarily anymore. Although every time we do print readership surveys, we get some people coming back to us saying, please don't can print because otherwise I wouldn't read the journal. But I read everything that I read in the medical sphere online by targeted search. So I think we have to tailor to different audiences. Some people still like print and a digest of information. Some people like to get an email bulletin to say, this is what's really exciting in this topic. some people, I think that the BMJ, who has deeper pockets than us, actually created their website so that it would show you stuff that was kind of targeted to you. They did a scan and discovered there were 4 kinds of reader, and like a researcher reader or a practicing clinician reader. And they managed to tailor their website so that if you're a researcher, it'll show you more research and will show you stuff from the other journals in the group and all that kind of stuff. So a bit of a tailoring of an experience that takes money and a lot of development. What I do notice about CMAJ is how popular the podcast is and how increasingly popular the podcast is. Like, and how people will talk to me about it, that they've never read the article to which it refers, but they love the podcast. And thinking about that and thinking about a way to understand how audio fits in to how people consume information and make sure that more of our information, not just a select few articles, are available in that kind of format, you know, digestible, short audio format that people can listen to in their car or while they're running on a treadmill or whatever, if that's what they do. So these are things that we're thinking about, but they take money to innovate and develop, and so we have to make business cases for them at CMAJ. I hope that answers the question.
There's another question from an online question. So the question is, given that scientists have to pay to publish in many journals, what are your thoughts about paying peer reviewers or giving them a discount on publication fees?
So historically, some journals did pay peer reviewers. Became an issue when I was working at the BMJ sort of 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more, where they decided that they couldn't afford to pay peer reviewers anymore, but they gave them a free subscription to the journal for a year online. So if you peer reviewed for BMJ, you would get this free subscription to the BMJ for a year, and they found that peer reviewers quite like that. But the CMAJ is all open access, so we can't give away a free subscription to the journal. It wouldn't help anybody. We talked about ways of creating CME or CPD credits for peer reviewers to do peer reviews. There are models that enable that, and that's something that we might do. Discounts is difficult to institute because you might do 5 great reviews and that entitles you to a 25% discount for publishing your paper in CMAJ, but your paper still has to get through peer review and make it to publication. So it's like, it's not a direct compensation. You may never get a publication in CMAJ. So I don't know that that would feel like frosting, you know, it would feel like marketing and not actually something that people could use. It's a tricky one, and answers on a postcard. If you have suggestions that we haven't thought of, that would be great.
Sorry, I was just gonna add to that last piece is, you know, I would say probably, and might be mistaken, the majority of peer reviewers are likely to be in an academic institution. And so, you know, even giving some kind of credit for that, whether it's through a letter, we get individuals sort of stating in their, you know, annual reports and so on that they're peer reviewers. But I find that it's hard to know, okay, does that mean that you reviewed one journal, one article, or have you, you know, what kind of work did you put in? So even being able to put some credit to it academically, I think would be really helpful, like some quantitative credit. Do you know what I mean? Because it's one thing to say, I'm a peer reviewer, but what exactly did you do as a peer reviewer?
Absolutely. So that's an interesting idea. And we do get kind of at regular intervals, folks saying, hey, I reviewed for CMAJ 3 times last year. Could you write me a letter to say that I did? If we could automate that, that would be wonderful. If you could go on your Scholar One account and just print out a report of what you peer reviewed, So that is something that we're looking at. The other thing is editors, in order to, I don't know what the purpose of this is, other than to kind of keep a record of peer reviewers who we think have done a great job on our system, but we rank peer reviewers on a 1 to 5 scale, and the peer reviewers who get a ranking of 5 during the year, at the end of the year, they get a letter thanking them for their outstanding review, which they could put in a portfolio if they wanted to. So there are things that we do. I just think it could be more consistent, automated, easier. So I'd love to hear if you have other ideas, but that was a good one. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to that as well. So, I think we are sort of seeing globally physician burnout as being an issue. And I'm just wondering whether you've noticed this effect in terms of your ability to get timely peer review. Certainly seen it in my sphere. Yeah. You might have to repeat the question. Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, have I seen burnout of peer reviewers? So this was a COVID effect as well. Sorry, I'm just going to have some water. People during COVID-19, it was amazing. Folks who were working their backs in clinical work and writing papers and peer reviewing much more than they usually would, just in the interest of advancing good science for the pandemic. And we have seen a real kind of burnout issue with peer reviewers since the pandemic, where people are just like, it's too much now. I'm tired. So there is that problem. And then the other thing is, if you do a good peer review, you're going to get asked again. And you'll probably get asked by a different editor handling a different paper at the same time. So I'm sure there must be people in this room who get like weekly 20 requests for peer review, and how do you select? I don't know. I think one of the ways that journals can help is to broaden the peer reviewer pool by offering peer review training for free, and also giving people good feedback or guidance on how to do a peer review, and facilitating mentorship. So we've had that ad hoc in the past, where a person will say, yes, I'd love to do this peer review, but I'd like to do it with my grad student, and we will submit it together and put both our names on it, or for the editor, we'll put both our names on it. And that kind of develops a new pool of peer reviewers, and it's great, but also ideas. You have some questions at the back.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the great talk. I guess my question is in regards to the audit of the EDI that you alluded to, and thanks for sharing that. I guess what conclusions came from that, and what steps is taking?
Yeah.
If the audit is overall.
Yeah, I'm just gonna open it up. It was a lot of recommendations, so I can't read them all out, but broadly they were in 3 categories, so or 4 actually. So the first one was using the trackpad. The first one was in terms of people and culture at the journal. So, this is one thing, a key thing that we have done is they recommended that we embed an AEDI lead into CMAJ's existing staff and governance structure. And we have done that recently, where a role got revamped so that 50% of that person's time would be dedicated to advancing EDI in the journal, and then and that we would within our own culture, develop a learning framework about historical injustices of the journal and in our processes, so that we could educate the people who work for us. Develop a mandatory learning framework for peer reviewers on implicit bias. That is very hard to institute, and it may be something as simple as when you agree to peer review, you'll get a pop-up that says, please read our policy on equitable peer review and then tick a box. But which is not great, but it's very difficult. I like something more onerous than that would put off peer reviews, and we're already struggling. And then also to build AEDI and performance measures into annual performance review processes for staff, which we're starting to do. The other bucket was community and partnerships. So was to develop a community engagement strategy, including listening sessions with priority communities, historically underserved communities. And we've definitely committed to all our advisory panels. So we have advisory panels for practice, a patient advisory panel, an advisory panel for medicine and society, and an editorial advisory board for the rest, and just in ensuring diversity on those. And then to develop and action a partnership framework with research institutions that have already implemented EDI strategies and demonstrated prioritizing research from equity deserving communities to enhance our publications in that area. And then the other thing was data collection and analysis about our own processes. So recently on submission, it became a possibility for us in our submission system to have people identify their ethnicity and race. It's voluntary, but to be able to kind of at the end of a year say, this is the picture that we have. Where are we going to go from there? Like, what's our target and what are we going to be able to do? And the other recommendation was to develop a transparent reporting framework for both the current AEDI situation at CMHA, what we plan to do, and then yearly after that, what we've managed to achieve. And then look at internal policies and practices, which is around staff education, ways of doing things, ways of decision-making, etc., that are biased, and implement new learning opportunities. Written down, transparent, and available so that people can consult it. So that was what was recommended and what we will action.
Thank you.
Do I need to speak into a mic for the? It's longer than 1 second. Back here. I really wondered what role, if any, journals like CMAG especially will have in what I would call the battle of legitimate journals against the absolute tsunami of rogue journals or predatory journals, as they're called. I was in the front lines of this. I retired just before the pandemic, my colleagues said very propitiously, with the result that I now became the sounding board for a circle of friends and families. Have you read this? Have you read this? And at first I tried to research them, and I found out very quickly almost none of them came from reputable journals. They were from, well, predatory journals. There was an excellent review of this done at our grand rounds, I think about 10 years ago. So from the public's viewpoint, this really erodes both truth and the prestige of legitimate journals. What do you see happening there in the future? They are multiplying like dandelions on my lawn in spring.
Yeah. That's actually a very difficult question to answer. Like, what can legitimate journals do about it? And I expect that the talk that you had was from David Mower, who's done the most work in this area of anybody, right? And also kind of like developing, so he's done work at the OHRI looking at the characteristics of a predatory journal, like, because it's like when you get a phishing attack email, you know, there are certain aspects to it that would make you think this is not quite legit, and not click on the link in that email. It's the same thing with predatory journals. It's the way they contact you, it's what they promise. So to educate researchers about those journals and what to look out for is one thing. We can't stop them from popping up like dandelions. The World Wide Web exists. You can do dodgy things, but to arm people with information, I think, is the best thing to do. The problem that we find, though, I'll give you a little anecdote, is so recently we published an article written by a patient as one of our new patient-focused, patient-centering article types. And after that was published, this person got these kind of emails to come and talk at a conference and submit their work, and were completely taken in by it because they had never encountered this before. So I think one of the things that journals can do is to educate people who don't come from the academic scientific environment and who don't necessarily know about this, that they may get these kinds of things happening after they publish, if it's a one-off thing. If you publish a humanities article and you're not a researcher and you don't really know about predatory journals, perhaps the journal that you're publishing in should let you know that there are downsides to publishing, right? And especially in an open access journal like CMHA, because those predatory journals can find those authors that much more easily and add them to whatever database they have.
Thanks very much. I wonder if you can comment on what role these, the costs of publishing are contributing to EDI problems. For example, you're not going to get people from low and middle income countries being able to pay the publishing fees. You know, like there's not many cardiologists here, but they have a lot of money. Most of us don't have that kind of money. Michelle shares her money, which is beautiful. So the point is that, you know, to get published nowadays, you have to have some extra cash on the side.
Yeah.
And so that, I think that's a huge problem. So open science is a great idea, great model, but in actual fact, it's increasing the inequities in science. That's the first question.
So also probably a longer than you would like answer to that. It's tricky. We have systems in place for people from low and middle income countries. It's clear on our website that the process is that if you don't have money for publication, that at the point of submission, you will email the publisher and say, look, if this gets published, we don't have the money for it, and here's the case for why we won't be able to pay the publication fee. So she's actually, I mean, she takes it on a case-by-case basis. There's a list of low-income countries where it's just, we don't charge authors from those countries. But then even within Canada, you'll be doing research off the side of your desk on an under-researched topic, and you want to get it out there, and CMHA is the place to get the most eyes on it. Can you make a case to the publisher? She usually says yes, or reduces the fee somewhat. It's worth a try. It's a problem though, that the way that the open access model has developed is just like, oh, well, people can pay and then we can make it open access. That's the thing, you know, that's if societies that own journals were doing their job, would say it's in the public interest for us to pour money into journals so that good science can, or well-run independent journals so that good science can flourish. The other thing I would say is, like, if you get a CIHR grant, there's usually money built in, but other projects are a little bit more difficult, and just to justify that, I think, and bring attention to it is a way to deal with it. It's not an easy thing to solve.
I would put it differently. If I have to publish that article and pay that fee, I can't have a summer student.
Right.
A graduate student or a resident, it's unfair to ask them to pay that fee if they're the lead author.
Yeah.
So and if you're, you know, there's clinicians in this institution that are publishing 30, 40 papers a year. Well, that's, if you add that up, that's a research coordinator. And I can't justify it.
Yeah.
I never pay those fees if I can get away with it.
So I'm curious, does your institution have, like the University of Toronto has, like an agreement with some publishers that they will publish X number of articles a year for free? Yeah.
Okay, well, I think you're here for a little while, so if there's any other questions, I would just welcome you to approach Dr. Patrick, and thank you on behalf of the department and the faculty. This was a great collaboration, so it was a wonderful topic, and there's another talk at 10 o'clock, I think. right?
Yes.
It's classroom that, but different, so I'd welcome you to attend. Thank you.